The alarm on my wrist console buzzed twice before I even opened my eyes, and I knew from the pattern alone that something had gone wrong. 2 short pulses meant a colony distress call. I was Elena Marsh, Senior Human Liaison to the Galactic Council, and I had exactly 4 minutes to reach the chamber before the session opened without me. I ran down the corridor of the Concord Spire, the massive rotating station that hosted every species with a seat at the table. My boots echoed against the polished floor, and delegates from 3 different worlds turned to watch me pass, their expressions unreadable behind masks, shells, or simply too many eyes. I did not stop to explain myself. There was no time. When I slid into my seat at the human delegation table, Daniel Cole was already standing, his hands folded in front of him, his posture calm and practiced. Daniel was our chief envoy, a man who had spent 15 years learning to smile at people who wanted us gone. He gave me a small nod, the kind that meant stay quiet and watch. On the central display, a red marker blinked over a small mining settlement on the edge of contested space. Aldergate Reach. I knew the name because my cousin worked there, running atmospheric processors on the surface. My stomach tightened. "Ambassador Cole," said the presiding officer, a tall insectoid Vecthari delegate named Chitrak, his mandibles clicking softly with each word. "Your colony reports an unprovoked strike from a Threll cruiser. Casualties are being confirmed. What is your response?" Daniel did not raise his voice. He never did. "We ask the Council to condemn this action and to demand an immediate withdrawal of Threll forces from the sector," he said. "We remain committed to a peaceful resolution." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the chamber. I felt it more than heard it, a shift in posture among several delegations, a tilt of heads that I had learned to recognize over the years. It was the look aliens gave us when they thought we were being predictable. Humanity, the polite ones, the species that always asked nicely. I had heard the jokes before, in hallways and private meetings I was not supposed to overhear. Humans apologize when you step on their foot. Humans thank you for insulting them. Humans would rather lose an argument than raise their voice. Some delegates found it endearing. Others found it useless, a sign that we had nothing behind the smiling. What none of them understood, and what I had spent years trying to explain in quiet conversations that nobody wanted to hear, was that our politeness was never a weakness. It was a choice we made every single day, over and over, because the alternative was something most of the galaxy had never actually seen. The Threll representative, a broad-shouldered being named Draeth Corin, rose from his seat across the chamber. His skin had the dull sheen of hardened plating, and his voice carried the flat confidence of someone who believed he already knew how this would end. "The colony was operating in a zone the Threll Dominion considers under dispute," he said. "Our vessel responded to what it perceived as a hostile presence. This is a matter of border enforcement, not aggression." Daniel's expression did not change. There was no hostile presence at Aldergate Reach. It is a civilian mining outpost. 211 residents. No weapons beyond standard mining equipment. "Then perhaps," Draeth said, and I caught the faint curl at the corner of his mouth. "Your people should have asked permission before settling there." The chamber went quiet in that particular way it did whenever someone tested a boundary in public. I glanced at Daniel. His hands were still folded. His voice, when it came, was as level as it had been a moment ago. "We will forward a formal request for a ceasefire and an independent inquiry," he said. "We trust the Council to act with fairness." I watched Draeth settle back into his seat, satisfied, as if he had just confirmed something he already believed. Around the chamber, a few delegates exchanged glances that I recognized as pity, the kind you give something small and harmless that has wandered somewhere dangerous. I leaned toward Daniel and kept my voice to a whisper only he could hear. "They are not going to stop with a formal request." "I know," he said, without looking at me. "That is not the point of the request." I did not understand what he meant, not then. I only knew that somewhere out past the edge of charted space, a Threll cruiser had opened fire on a settlement full of people who processed rock and ice for a living, and that our official response had been to ask, politely, for it to stop. The session continued for another hour, filled with procedural motions and translated statements from a dozen different worlds, none of whom seemed particularly alarmed. I sat through it with my jaw tight, watching the red marker over Aldergate Reach blink steadily on the display, a small dot representing 211 people I had never met but somehow felt responsible for. When the session finally closed, Daniel gathered his files without a word and walked toward the private corridor reserved for human staff. I followed him, matching his pace, waiting for him to say something that would explain the calm I could not understand. "You let him talk to you like that," I said, once we were alone. "You let the whole chamber watch him say we should have asked permission to exist somewhere." Daniel stopped walking. He turned to face me, and for the first time that day, I saw something behind his eyes that was not patience. It was something colder, something held very carefully in place, like a door braced shut against wind. "Elena," he said, "how much do you actually know about why we speak the way we do in that room?" "I know the doctrine," I said. "Courtesy first. De-escalate. Never give them a reason to call us the aggressor." "That is the policy," he agreed, "but it is not the reason." He glanced down the corridor, empty except for the two of us, and lowered his voice anyway. "Every species in that chamber has a file on us. Threat assessments, historical summaries, behavioral predictions. Do you know what almost all of them say about humanity?" I shook my head. "They say we are cooperative, non-confrontational, and low risk," he said. "They say it because that is how we have presented ourselves for 30 years. Every session, every negotiation, every trade dispute. We have been very patient people, Elena, on purpose." "On purpose," I repeated. "There is a difference," Daniel said quietly, "between a species that cannot fight and a species that has decided not to. Most of the galaxy stopped bothering to learn which one we are. It was easier to assume we were harmless." He started walking again, and I fell into step beside him. "The Threll are about to learn which one we actually are, and I am not looking forward to being in the room when it happens." I wanted to ask him what he meant, exactly, by that last sentence. But something in his face told me the answer was not something he was ready to say out loud yet, not even to me. So I stayed quiet, and I walked with him back toward the human quarter of the station, past windows that looked out over the endless dark, wondering how many other conversations like this one had happened over the years, in corridors just like this, among people who understood something about us that I was only now beginning to see. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the settlement, about the casual way Draeth Corin had suggested that 211 civilians deserved what happened to them because they had not asked permission to live where they lived. I kept thinking about the way the chamber had reacted, not with outrage, but with a kind of bored amusement, as though watching a predictable animal perform a predictable trick. I pulled up the public records on Aldergate Reach, scrolling through images of the settlement before the attack. Simple structures built for function rather than beauty, greenhouses attached to processing units, a small school building near the center of the compound. My cousin had sent me pictures once, laughing about the terrible food and the endless dust storms. Ordinary people doing ordinary work, 300 light-years from anything that could reasonably be called a threat to anyone. I thought about Daniel's words, a species that has decided not to fight. I had grown up hearing about our history in school the way most people did, as a story with a clear arc, wars that ended, treaties that held, a species that had climbed out of its own violent past and chosen something better. I had always understood that history as something we left behind. It had never occurred to me to wonder whether we had left it behind, or whether we had simply learned to keep it quiet. Somewhere above me, through the reinforced viewport of my quarters, the lights of a dozen alien vessels moved slowly across the black, going about their business, indifferent to the small crisis unfolding at the edge of human space. I watched them for a long time before I finally closed my eyes, and even then, sleep did not come easily. I woke to another alert, this one longer than the first, 4 pulses instead of 2. I knew before I even reached for the console that whatever had happened overnight was worse than what had come before, and that whatever calm Daniel Cole had been holding on to in that corridor was about to be tested in front of the entire council. The council chamber felt different that morning. I noticed it the moment I walked in, a kind of electric stillness that had not been there the day before. Delegates who normally arrived in loose clusters, trading small talk before the session opened, now sat at their tables in silence, reviewing files on their private screens. Something had shifted overnight, and I had a sinking feeling I already knew what it was. Daniel was already at the human table when I arrived, and Grace Milton sat beside him, our chief military liaison, a woman I had worked with for years but rarely saw outside of formal briefings. Grace had a reputation for saying very little and meaning every word of it when she did speak. Her presence told me this was no longer a matter for diplomats alone. "What happened?" I asked, sliding into my seat. "A second strike," Grace said, her voice low. "Overnight. The Threll cruiser returned with reinforcements. They hit the processing facility and the residential dome." My chest went tight. "Casualties?" "43 confirmed dead," she said. 60 more injured. The colony defense militia held them off from taking the school building, but only barely." I thought of the picture I had looked at the night before, the small school near the center of the compound, and I had to close my eyes for a moment before I could speak again. 43 people, I said, for border enforcement. "That is the language they are still using," Daniel said. Border enforcement. He was looking straight ahead at the podium, where Chitrak was already gathering the chamber's attention with a series of sharp clicks from his mandibles. "Elena, I need you to watch me very closely today. Not the council, me." I did not understand the request, but I nodded anyway. The session opened with a formal reading of casualty figures, delivered in the flat, procedural tone the council used for matters it considered routine. I watched several delegates react with what looked like genuine concern, murmurs passing between the Caliph and Ombresi tables, a species we had always found to be quietly sympathetic to human interests. But others, including a cluster of smaller trade-focused delegations, barely looked up from their screens, treating the report as background noise to whatever business they considered more pressing. Draeth Corin rose again when his turn came, and this time there was no attempt at diplomatic phrasing at all. "The colony refused to withdraw after our first warning," he said. "Our forces responded accordingly. If the human delegation wishes to avoid further losses, I would suggest they finally comply with the boundary we established months ago." I felt my hands curl into fists beneath the table. Beside me, Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on Draeth with an intensity I had not seen from him before. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, and something about that quiet made the entire chamber lean in to listen. "There was no warning," Daniel said. "There was an unprovoked attack on a civilian settlement, followed by a second unprovoked attack that killed 43 more civilians while this council was still debating the language of a resolution about the first one." Draeth's plated shoulders rose in something like a shrug. "Warnings were sent through appropriate channels. Perhaps your systems failed to receive them." "There were no warnings," Daniel repeated, and this time the words came out flatter, stripped of the careful warmth he usually carried into every sentence. I glanced at Grace. She was watching Daniel now too, not the Threll delegate, her expression unreadable. Chitrak raised a limb to intervene, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades keeping fragile alliances from breaking apart in this very room. "The Council will review all communication logs to determine whether proper channels were followed. In the meantime, we ask both parties to exercise restraint while a resolution is drafted." "A resolution," Daniel said. He let the word sit in the air for a moment. "How long will that take?" "Council procedure requires a minimum of 72 hours for formal drafting and delegate review," Chitrak said. 72 hours, Daniel repeated, during which the Threll fleet remains in position around a civilian settlement that has already lost 43 residents in 2 separate attacks. "The Council understands your frustration, Ambassador Cole, but procedure exists for a reason." I watched Daniel's jaw tighten, just slightly, a small movement that anyone not looking closely would have missed. But I was looking closely, because he had asked me to, and I saw something pass behind his eyes that I had never seen there before. It was not anger exactly. It was something older than that, something that had been sitting very still for a very long time and had just shifted its weight. He did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand on the table the way I had half expected, half hoped he would. Instead, his next words came out measured and quiet, each one placed with the same careful precision as always, except now that precision felt less like courtesy and more like control. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for clarifying the procedure." The session moved on to other matters, trade disputes between two mineral-rich systems, a dispute over shipping lanes near a nebula I had never heard of, business as usual, continuing around the edges of a crisis that had already cost dozens of lives. I found it almost unbearable to sit through, the casual rhythm of the chamber grinding forward, while a colony full of people waited to find out if they would survive the week. During a brief recess, I followed Daniel and Grace into a side room reserved for private consultations. The moment the door sealed behind us, Grace turned to Daniel with an expression I had never seen her wear before, something between exhaustion and grim anticipation. "They are not going to stop," she said. "Draeth is testing us. He wants to know exactly how far he can push before we do something about it." "I know," Daniel said. "The colony militia cannot hold another strike like the last one," Grace continued. "If the Threll come back tonight, we lose the whole settlement." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at a point on the wall that held nothing in particular. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the last traces of the careful warmth I had known him to use in every meeting I had ever sat through with him. "Then we stop asking," he said. I looked between the two of them, feeling like I was missing a conversation that had been happening somewhere above my level of clearance for longer than I realized. "Stop asking what, exactly?" Grace looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something like sympathy in her expression, the kind you give someone about to learn something that will change how they see the world. "Elena," she said, "how much do you know about what we actually keep in reserve out here?" "I know the fleet postures," I said. "Defensive doctrine, minimal force presence in contested sectors to avoid provoking incidents." "That is what we show the Council," Grace said. "It is not the whole picture." "What is the whole picture?" Daniel answered before Grace could. "The whole picture is that we have spent 30 years being the quiet ones in that room," he said, "because it kept the peace, and because most of the galaxy assumed quiet meant harmless, and we let them believe it because the alternative was worse for everyone, including us." He finally turned to look at me directly. "But there was always a line. We never told anyone where it was, because the moment you tell people where a line is, they start testing exactly how close they can get to it without crossing over." "And the Threll just crossed it," I said. "The Threll crossed it yesterday morning," Daniel said. "Everything since then has been us deciding how to respond without losing what we have spent 30 years building. Every hour we wait, every polite request we make, is a choice, not a limitation. I need the Council to understand that difference before this is over, because once it becomes clear, they will remember it about us for a very long time." The recess bell rang, calling delegates back to the chamber. Daniel straightened his jacket, took a slow breath, and for just a moment I watched him rebuild the calm, composed expression that had carried him through every session I had ever seen him in. It was like watching someone put on a piece of armor, deliberate and practiced, each part settling into place. "Elena," he said, as we walked back toward the chamber doors, "whatever happens in that room today, do not react. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, I need you steady. The rest of the galaxy is about to learn something about us, and I need at least one human face in that room that looks like this, was always going to happen exactly this way." I did not fully understand what he meant, but I nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and because some part of me had already begun to suspect that whatever calm Daniel Cole had carried into that chamber every day for 15 years was about to be tested in a way it had never been tested before, in front of an audience that had no idea what they were about to see. We took our seats as Chitrak called the session back to order. Across the chamber, Draeth Corin was already speaking with another Threll officer beside him, their heads bent close together, satisfied smiles on both their faces. They had no idea, I realized, watching them. They genuinely believed they were winning. I glanced at Daniel one last time before the session resumed. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, still and composed, exactly as they had been every day since I had known him. But his eyes, when they found mine for just a moment, held something I had never seen in them before, something patient and cold and absolutely certain, and for the first time since I had joined the diplomatic corps, I felt genuinely afraid of what my own species was capable of. The session had barely resumed when the alert came through, a sharp tone that cut across every private screen in the chamber at once. I saw delegates from a dozen species glance down in unison, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath together. Chitrak read the update aloud, his voice tight in a way I had never heard from him before. A third strike has occurred at Aldergate Reach. The Threll cruiser has opened fire on the residential dome directly. Colony Defense Forces report the shield generator has failed. The room erupted into overlapping voices, delegates from a dozen worlds speaking at once, some in outrage, some in confusion, a few, I noticed, in barely concealed satisfaction. I turned to look at Draeth Corin. He was not even trying to hide his expression anymore. He looked, for lack of a better word, pleased. The shield generator failed because our forces targeted it directly, he said, once the chamber quieted enough for him to be heard. A tactical decision, made in response to continued human non-compliance. Daniel rose from his seat. I had watched him stand up in that chamber 100 times before, always with the same measured pace, the same careful posture. This time was different. This time, the movement was sharp, economical, a man rising because he had made a decision rather than because procedure required him to speak. "Define non-compliance," Daniel said. Draeth blinked, apparently surprised by the bluntness of the question. "Your colony remains in a zone the Threll Dominion has claimed. Your fleet has not withdrawn from the surrounding sector. Your government has not agreed to our proposed boundary." "You proposed that boundary 4 days ago," Daniel said. "You gave us 72 hours to respond through proper channels, the same 72 hours this council requires for a formal resolution. You attacked our colony before that window even closed." "The boundary was not open to negotiation," Draeth said. "It was a notification." "Then call it what it was," Daniel said. "An ultimatum, delivered without warning, enforced with violence against civilians, while this council debated procedure." The chamber had gone very quiet. I realized I was holding my breath, and I made myself breathe slowly, the way Daniel had asked me to remain steady, though I had no idea what steady was supposed to look like anymore. Chitrak attempted, one more time, to steer the session back toward familiar ground. "Ambassador Cole, the Council understands the severity of this situation, but any response must go through." "No," Daniel said. It was one word. I do not think I had ever heard him interrupt a presiding officer before, not once, in all the sessions I had sat through beside him. The chamber's murmur died instantly. Even Draeth's satisfied expression flickered, just slightly, into something closer to confusion. "I am sorry," Chitrak said, his mandibles clicking with what sounded almost like genuine surprise. "Could you repeat that, Ambassador?" "No," Daniel said again, and this time his voice carried through the entire chamber without needing to be raised at all. "We will not wait 72 hours for a resolution, while a colony under fire loses another life every few minutes. We will not continue treating this as a matter for procedure, while an active shooter remains in position around a civilian dome with a failed shield generator. Ambassador Cole, I must remind you that unilateral action outside Council authorization carries." "I am aware of what it carries," Daniel said. "I have read the charter more times than most of the delegates in this room. I know exactly what we are permitted to do without council authorization in the event of an active threat to human civilian life. We have simply chosen, for 30 years, not to use it. I felt something shift in the air of the chamber, a kind of collective recalibration happening in real time, dozens of species running the same silent calculation. I looked around and saw it on face after face, in posture after posture, the particular stillness of beings recognizing that something they had assumed about the world was no longer true. Drayeth recovered his composure and forced a short laugh, though it came out thinner than he probably intended. "Are you threatening this council, Ambassador?" "I am informing this council," Daniel said, "that human forces are moving to relieve Aldergate Reach immediately, under our own authority, in accordance with our own charter rights regarding the protection of civilian life. I am also informing the Threll delegation that any vessel remaining in that sector after our forces arrive will be treated as an active combatant, not as a party to an ongoing negotiation." "You would risk open conflict with the Threll Dominion over a mining outpost?" Drayth said, and I heard, underneath the bravado, the first genuine note of uncertainty in his voice. "We are not risking conflict," Daniel said. "Your forces created the conflict 3 days ago. We are simply choosing, as of this moment, to stop pretending otherwise." I watched him during those words, watched the man I had known for years, the one who apologized when he bumped shoulders with a stranger in a hallway, the one who thanked hostile delegates for their time even after being insulted, the one who had spent 15 years being the most patient person in every room he entered. That man was still standing there, still wearing the same face, the same posture, the same folded hands, but something underneath all of it had gone very quiet and very still, like the surface of deep water right before something enormous moves beneath it. "This is unprecedented," Chitrak said, his voice unsteady now. "The Council cannot simply stand by while member species engage in." "The Council has been standing by for 3 days," Daniel said, "while 43 civilians died and a settlement's defenses were systematically dismantled. I am not asking the Council's permission anymore. I am informing you of what is already happening, because unlike the Threll delegation, we believe in transparency even when we are done being patient." A murmur passed through the room again, but this time it was different, quieter, more careful. I saw the Ombresi delegate, an ancient, silver-skinned being named Sael Ithorn who rarely spoke in open session, lean forward and study Daniel with an expression I could only describe as recognition, as though something long theorized had just been confirmed in front of her. Drayth's confidence had visibly cracked now, though he tried to cover it with volume. "Threll forces will not withdraw simply because a diplomat raises his voice in a council chamber." "I have not raised my voice," Daniel said, and it was true. He had not once, through the entire exchange. His tone remained exactly as level as it had been for years, and somehow that made it worse, made it land harder than if he had shouted, "I am simply telling you what is already true. Your cruiser and its reinforcements are currently facing 3 vessels that departed human territory 11 hours ago, before this session even began, following standard protocol for civilian rescue operations. They will arrive at Aldergate Reach within the hour." I stared at Daniel, stunned. He had known this entire time, sitting through the earlier session, through the recess, through Grace's grim briefing in the side room, that ships were already moving. He had let the Council believe we were still debating a resolution while human forces were already 3 hours from launch, and he had done it without a single change in his expression. "You committed an act of war before informing this Council," Chitrak said, his voice climbing toward something close to panic. "I committed an act of rescue," Daniel said, "in accordance with a charter this Council itself wrote and ratified, which explicitly permits member species to protect their civilians from imminent lethal threat without prior Council authorization. I did not need to inform this Council first. I chose to inform you now because I believe, even in this moment, that transparency matters." He paused, and when he continued, his voice dropped slightly, gaining a weight that seemed to press against every corner of the chamber. "We tried patience." Every single day for 3 days we tried patience, in this room, in front of all of you, while people died. You mistook our patience for our ceiling. The words landed in absolute silence. I felt them land, felt the temperature of the entire chamber drop several degrees in the space of that one sentence. Even Draeth Corin, standing tall and armored and confident just minutes earlier, seemed to shrink slightly where he stood, as if some instinct older than his species' entire diplomatic history had just kicked in and told him, very clearly, that he had made a terrible mistake. I glanced at Grace, seated beside me, watching the exchange with the calm, focused expression of someone who had known exactly what was coming and had simply been waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. She met my eyes briefly and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "This is what I meant." Chitrak struggled to regain control of the session, his usual composure fractured in a way I had never witnessed. The Council demands an immediate cessation of unilateral human military action pending formal review. Request received, Daniel said. It will be considered alongside your review of the Threll Dominion's unilateral military action against a civilian settlement, which has been ongoing for 3 days without a single formal condemnation from this body. He sat back down. I remember that most vividly, more than anything he had said, the simple, unhurried way he lowered himself back into his chair, folded his hands again, and waited, as though he had just finished discussing a minor scheduling matter, rather than announcing that human forces were actively engaging a foreign military in defense of a civilian colony. His face had returned, almost entirely, to the calm and pleasant expression I had known for years. But his eyes had not. His eyes remained fixed on Draeth Corin with a stillness that made my skin prickle even from where I sat. The chamber dissolved into noise after that, delegates shouting over one another in a dozen languages, translation systems overlapping into a wall of confused sound. I sat frozen in my seat, trying to process what I had just witnessed, the sensation of watching something enormous and quiet finally reveal even a fraction of its true shape, right there in the middle of a room that had spent 30 years assuming it already understood us completely. Beside me, Daniel leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper, meant only for me. "Now you understand what I meant about the switch," he said. "It was never that we could not fight, Elena. It was that we chose not to, every single day, on purpose. Because the alternative costs more than most people in this room could ever imagine. Draeth just found out what happens when that choice gets taken away from us." I looked at him, at the calm, composed man sitting beside me who had just, without raising his voice once, informed an entire galactic council that humanity had quietly gone to war 3 hours before anyone in that chamber even realized it, and I understood, finally, exactly what kind of patience I had been watching all along. News from Aldergate Reach reached the chamber less than an hour later, and the entire council watched it unfold together. Delegates who had been shouting moments earlier now leaning forward in absolute silence, watching the same feed I was watching on my own console. The 3 human vessels arrived exactly when Daniel had said they would. What followed was not the chaotic, drawn-out battle I think most of the room expected, based on whatever assumptions they carried about a species that spent its diplomatic career apologizing for existing. It was fast, precise, and almost clinical. The Threll cruiser and its 2 reinforcement vessels attempted evasive maneuvers within minutes of the human ships dropping out of transit, but the response had clearly been planned with a level of coordination that suggested this was not improvisation. It was doctrine, executed exactly as designed. I watched the tactical display update in real time, small markers shifting and reorganizing as the human fleet moved to encircle rather than destroy, disabling engine and weapon systems on all 3 Threll vessels within the first 20 minutes of engagement. No hull breaches, no mass casualties. Just a swift, overwhelming demonstration of control, followed immediately by a formal transmission offering the surviving Threll crews safe evacuation to a neutral station, provided they surrendered their weapons systems. Grace explained it to me quietly as the feed played out. "We do not fight to destroy," she said. "We never have." Destruction creates martyrs and grievances that last generations. We fight to end the threat as quickly and cleanly as possible, and then we offer the other side a way to walk away from it. That is the whole doctrine. It has been the whole doctrine since before either of us were born. Then why does everyone assume we cannot fight at all? I asked. Because we have never needed to prove otherwise, Grace said. Until today. By the time the feed confirmed that all 3 Threll vessels had stood down and the shield generator crews at Aldergate Reach had begun emergency repairs, the chamber had gone almost eerily quiet. I looked around at delegate after delegate, watching expressions shift from disbelief to something more complicated, a recalculation happening across dozens of species at once. Chitrak called the session back to formal order, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. The Threll Dominion's forces have been neutralized without significant loss of life on either side, he said, reading from an update on his screen. Human forces report the operation as concluded. Draeth Corin sat very still at his table, his earlier confidence entirely gone. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the sharp certainty it had held just an hour before. This will be viewed as an act of aggression against Threll's sovereign forces. It will be viewed, Daniel said, as exactly what it was. A rescue operation conducted after 3 days of your forces attacking an undefended civilian settlement, during which this council debated procedure while people died. I would encourage your government to consider very carefully how that record will read to the rest of this chamber. I noticed movement at the far end of the room and turned to see Sael Ethorn rising from her seat, something the elder Ombresi delegate rarely did during open session. The chamber's attention shifted to her immediately, the ancient respect afforded to the Ombresi delegation still holding even in the middle of such a chaotic day. I would like to address the chamber, she said, her voice slow and measured, carrying the particular weight of someone who had outlived most of the species currently seated around her. Many of you are, I suspect, surprised by what you witnessed today. I was not. A murmur passed through the room, and she waited for it to settle before continuing. The Ombresi archives contain detailed records of human history predating their entry into this council, she said. Records most delegations chose not to review closely because humanity presented itself, quite deliberately I now understand, as a species with little appetite for conflict. We noted, decades ago, the discrepancy between humanity's historical record and its diplomatic posture. We recorded our concerns in a formal advisory circulated to all member species 11 years ago. She paused, letting that settle. I recall that advisory received very little attention at the time. I glanced at Daniel. He was watching Sael Ithorn with an expression of quiet respect, the first genuine emotion I had seen cross his face since the session began. The advisory stated, in essence, Sael Ithorn continued, that humanity's courteous behavior in this chamber should be understood as a diplomatic policy actively maintained through discipline and choice, not as an accurate reflection of the species' underlying capability or history. We warned that mistaking policy for personality would eventually produce exactly the kind of miscalculation we witnessed today. She turned her gaze toward Draeth Corin, and though her voice never rose, there was something unmistakably pointed in it now. I am sorry that the Threll Dominion did not read our advisory more carefully. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she sat back down. I found myself staring at Daniel, thinking about the conversation in the side room, about his insistence that I remain steady, about the calm, careful way he had built and maintained his reputation in this chamber for 15 years, one polite sentence at a time, so that a moment like this could exist when it was finally needed. Chitrak cleared whatever passed for a throat among his species and attempted to restore some sense of formal order to the session. The Council will require formal statements from both delegations regarding the events of the past 3 days, he said. In the meantime, given the resolution of the immediate crisis, I move that this session be adjourned to allow all parties time to prepare their statements. The motion passed with unusual speed, nobody in the chamber seeming particularly eager to continue debating in the wake of what had just happened. Delegates began filing out in small clusters, their conversations hushed, their body language noticeably different from the casual confidence I had watched them carry into the chamber that morning. I stayed in my seat as the room emptied, watching Daniel gather his files with the same unhurried precision he always used, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Grace remained beside him, occasionally exchanging quiet words about logistics, about the injured at Aldergate Reach, about the surrendered Threll crews being processed at the neutral station. When the chamber had mostly cleared, I finally found my voice again. "You knew all of this would happen," I said. "The advisory from the Ombresi, the timing of the ships, all of it. You knew this exact moment was coming." "I knew something like it would eventually come," Daniel said. "I did not know when, or with which species, or what the trigger would be. But Elena, you cannot maintain 30 years of deliberate restraint without understanding very clearly what happens the day that restraint finally runs out. We have discussed this scenario more times than you would believe, in rooms far less public than this one." "And the advisory," I said. "The one Sael Ethorn mentioned. Did you know about it?" Daniel allowed himself something close to a small, tired smile. "I helped draft the human government's confidential response to it," he said. 11 years ago, we thanked the Ombresi for their concern and quietly continued exactly as before." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, trying to reconcile the calm, apologetic diplomat I had worked beside for years with the man who had just, without ever raising his voice, orchestrated a military response the entire galaxy would be discussing for months. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before today?" "Because you needed to watch it happen the way the rest of the galaxy watched it happen," Daniel said, "before you could understand it the way I need you to understand it now. It is not enough to be told that our patience is a choice, Elena. You have to see the moment the choice ends, and you have to see how quickly it returns once the threat is gone, before you really understand what we are. Words alone would not have done that." I looked past him, out through the wide viewport at the edge of the chamber, where the lights of departing delegations blinked steadily against the dark. Somewhere out there, a colony was already beginning repairs, a shield generator crew working through the night to restore what had been broken. 3 Threll vessels sitting powerless under human escort, their crews processing what had just happened to their entire understanding of the species they had chosen to test. "What happens now?" I asked. Daniel finished gathering his files and looked at me with an expression that had already, remarkably, returned almost entirely to the calm, patient warmth I had known him to carry for years. It was as though the last hour had simply folded itself away, tucked carefully back behind a door that had briefly stood open and was now closing again, deliberately, the same way it had opened. "Now," he said, "we go back to being exactly who we were yesterday. Polite, patient, easy to underestimate." He allowed himself a small, quiet breath, something almost like relief. "That is the part nobody in that chamber understands yet, Elena. The switch does not just turn off, it turns back on, just as completely, the moment the threat is gone. That is what makes it a discipline, and not a weakness at all." 3 weeks passed before the council reconvened in full session to formally close the matter of Aldergate Reach, and in that time I watched something quietly remarkable unfold across the station. It was not fear, exactly, though there was some of that in certain delegations. It was something closer to careful reevaluation, the kind of quiet, deliberate adjustment a species makes after discovering it has been operating on an incomplete map for far longer than it realized. The Threll Dominion issued a formal statement acknowledging responsibility for the attacks on Aldergate Reach, along with an agreement to withdraw all forces from the disputed sector and submit to council-supervised border arbitration going forward. Draith Corin was quietly replaced as lead delegate before the closing session, though nobody in the chamber commented on it directly. His successor, a younger, visibly more cautious Threll representative named Corin Vale, spent most of the closing session listening rather than speaking, taking careful notes each time a human delegate addressed the room. I sat beside Daniel and Grace for that final session, watching the chamber fill in a way that felt different from every session I had attended before. Delegates who had once greeted our arrival with the same mild, dismissive courtesy they extended to any minor delegation, now watched us with a kind of careful attention, the sort you give something you have recently discovered you understood far less than you assumed. Chitrak opened the session with a formal summary of the incident, his tone measured and precise, entirely restored to its usual authority now that the crisis itself had passed. The Council recognizes the human delegation's response as consistent with Charter provisions regarding civilian protection, he said. The Council further acknowledges its own delay in addressing the initial attacks contributed to the escalation of the incident, and commits to reviewing emergency response procedures for future matters of this nature. It was, I understood, about as close to an apology as the Council's formal language ever came, and I noticed Daniel accept it with the same quiet grace he accepted everything else, a small nod, a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. When the floor opened for closing statements, Sael Ethorn rose again, and the chamber quieted for her with the same automatic respect it always did. "I would like to offer a final observation," she said, "not as a matter of formal record, but as something I believe this council would benefit from remembering long after today's session ends." She turned, slowly, to look across the chamber at delegation after delegation, and when her gaze reached the human table, she paused there longer than anywhere else. "For 30 years," she said, "this council has understood humanity through a single, narrow lens, cooperative, non-confrontational, easily satisfied with small concessions. We built our expectations of an entire species around a diplomatic posture we mistook for the whole of their character, and we did so, I think, because it was simply more comfortable to believe the smiling, patient delegation across the room posed no risk to anyone." She paused. "I would ask this council to consider, going forward, that patience maintained deliberately over decades is not the same as patience born of limitation. It is, I believe, considerably more formidable." She sat down, and for a long moment nobody spoke. I glanced at Daniel, who was watching her with an expression of quiet gratitude, the kind reserved for someone who had said something true on your behalf that you could never have said as convincingly yourself. When the session finally moved toward closing procedure, Corin Vale, the new Threll delegate, rose from his seat with visible hesitation, clearing whatever passed among his species for uncertainty before speaking. "The Threll Dominion wishes to formally extend its apologies to the human delegation," he said, "for the loss of life at Aldergate Reach, and for any miscalculation regarding the nature of human restraint." Daniel rose to respond, and I watched him carefully, curious how he would meet this moment after everything that had passed between our two delegations over the previous weeks. His posture was exactly what I had come to expect from him across years of sessions: calm, measured, unhurried. "The human delegation accepts the Threll Dominion's apology," he said, "and looks forward to a more constructive relationship going forward, built on clearer understanding on both sides." He paused, and something in his tone softened, just slightly, into something that sounded almost like genuine warmth. "We hold no lasting resentment toward the Threll people for this incident. Miscalculations happen between species still learning one another. What matters now is what we choose to build from here." I watched Corin Vale's posture relax slightly at those words, some of the visible tension leaving his frame, and I understood, in that moment, exactly what Daniel had meant weeks earlier about the switch turning back on just as completely as it had turned off. There was no lingering edge in his voice, no quiet threat beneath the surface of his courtesy. The calm had returned entirely, not as a performance, but as the genuine, deliberate default it had always been. After the session closed, I walked with Daniel and Grace back through the long corridor toward the human quarter of the station, past viewports showing the same endless dark I had stared into weeks earlier, unable to sleep, turning over everything I thought I understood about my own species. "Do you think they will remember this?" I asked, "or will it fade the way everything eventually fades around here?" "Some of them will forget," Daniel said. "Some species always do, but the ones who matter, the ones like the Ombresi, who actually keep careful records and think in centuries rather than sessions, they will remember." And that is enough. We were never trying to convince everyone. We were only ever trying to make sure the ones who mattered understood the truth, so that the next time someone considers testing us, there is at least one voice in the room who remembers today and says, quietly, perhaps you should reconsider. Grace walked a step behind us, quiet as always, though I noticed a small, satisfied set to her shoulders that told me she considered the entire matter closed in exactly the way it should be. I keep thinking about what you told me, I said, about the switch turning off and back on completely. I watched it happen. I still do not fully understand how you do it, how you carry both parts of yourself so completely, one after the other, without either one ever bleeding into the wrong moment. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering, his pace slowing slightly as we approached the human quarters entrance. It is not two different people, Elena, he said. That is the part most of the galaxy still does not understand, even after today. It is one person, making one choice, over and over, every single day. The courtesy is not a mask covering something dangerous underneath. It is a decision, renewed constantly, about what kind of galaxy we want to help build. The moment that decision stops making sense, when patience no longer serves anyone, including the people testing us, we simply stop making it. And the moment it makes sense again, we go right back to making it, because that was always the actual goal. Not weakness, not aggression, just a choice, held carefully, every single day, by people who understand exactly what the alternative costs. We reached the entrance to the human quarter, and Daniel paused there, looking back out through the wide viewport at the distant lights of 100 other delegations going about their business, unaware or only newly aware of the lesson that had passed through their chamber weeks earlier. We did not lose our manners that day, Elena, he said quietly, almost to himself. We only showed the rest of them what had been holding those manners in place the entire time. I stood beside him for a long moment, watching the same lights he was watching, thinking about Aldergate Reach, about the school building near the center of the compound, about 43 names that would be remembered by very few people outside our own species, and about the strange, quiet comfort of understanding, finally and completely, exactly what kind of restraint I had been standing beside all along. Then Daniel turned, offered me the same warm, unhurried smile he had offered every delegate in every session for 15 years, and said, in a voice that carried nothing but genuine, patient courtesy, "Shall we get some rest? Tomorrow's session starts early, and I believe we have a trade dispute to smooth over with the Caliph delegation. Best to be well rested for it." I laughed, despite everything, because it was such a small, ordinary thing to say after everything we had just witnessed, and because I finally understood that this was in fact the entire point. I followed him through the doors, back into the quiet, familiar rhythm of a species that had chosen, deliberately and every single day, to be kind, and that the whole galaxy had just learned, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what that choice was worth.